Long before the marble columns of Athens or the arches of Rome rose from the earth, a civilization was already flourishing along the banks of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq, a civilization that would come to be known as Assyria. And its story begins humbly enough with a small trading town called Ashur, founded sometime around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, on a defensible bend of the river where merchants could load and unload barges carrying grain, timber, and metal ore. And over the centuries, this modest settlement grew wealthy from its position along the trade routes linking the mountains of Anatolia to the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia, and its people took the name of their patron god, Ashur, as their own, calling themselves Assyrians, a people who for a long stretch of their early history existed in the shadow of larger and more powerful neighbors, sometimes independent, sometimes absorbed into the empires of Babylon or the Hittites or the Mitanni, rising and falling in cycles that repeated for the better part of 1,000 years, until the world around them was suddenly and catastrophically upended by what historians now call the Late Bronze Age collapse, a mysterious and still poorly understood wave of destruction that swept across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East around 1200 to 1150 BC, toppling the Hittite Empire, devastating the Mycenaean palaces of Greece, and plunging much of the civilized world into a dark age from which few societies would ever fully recover. And yet, Assyria was one of the rare survivors, in large part because its kings made the difficult decision to abandon their more distant territories and pull back to a defensible heartland, preserving the core of their state even as everything around it burned. And it was in the smoldering aftermath of this collapse that a new material began to reshape the ancient world: iron. A metal far more abundant in the Earth's crust than the bronze-making copper and tin that previous empires had depended on. And Assyrian smiths, no longer able to rely on fragile long-distance supply chains for their weapons, began forging blades, spearheads, and armor from this new and democratized metal, giving their soldiers an edge that would prove decisive in the centuries to come. And one of the first kings to capitalize on this opportunity was Tiglath-Pileser I, who took the throne around 1114 BC and led his armies on a series of aggressive campaigns that pushed Assyrian influence west toward the Mediterranean coast for the first time, a moment so novel for a landlocked people that later inscriptions describe the king's astonishment at simply boarding a ship. And although Assyria's fortunes ebbed again in the centuries after his death, the empire found its footing once more under a line of increasingly ambitious rulers, culminating in the reign of Ashurnasirpal II, who came to power in 883 BC and became infamous even among his contemporaries for the brutality of his campaigns, boasting in his own royal inscriptions of flaying rebels alive, impaling captives on stakes, and building towers out of severed heads as a warning to any city that dared resist Assyrian rule, tactics that were undeniably effective in the short term at cowing potential rebels into submission. And Ashurnasirpal used the wealth flowing in from conquered territories to build a magnificent new capital at Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud, filling it with palaces decorated in carved stone reliefs, imported cedar wood, and looted treasures from a dozen subject peoples. And this pattern of conquest, tribute, and monumental building continued under his son Shalmaneser III, whose reign nonetheless ended in a bitter civil war that revealed just how fragile the empire's unity could be beneath its militaristic surface, a fragility that a later king named Tiglath-Pileser III would address through one of the most consequential military reforms in ancient history, transforming the Assyrian army from a seasonal levy of farmers, who had to be released each autumn to bring in the harvest, into a genuinely professional standing force capable of remaining in the field year-round, complete with specialized engineering corps able to build siege ramps, bridge rivers, and cut roads through mountain passes that had previously been considered impassable. And this new army allowed Assyria to conduct the kind of prolonged sieges that had once been logistically impossible, famously starving out the rebellious city of Arpad over the course of 3 full years. a feat that sent an unmistakable message to every other city in the region that the old strategy of simply waiting out the invaders behind city walls would no longer work. And under Tiglath-Pileser III and his successors, the empire expanded to encompass nearly the entire Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, absorbing the wealthy and ancient city of Babylon into its orbit. A city so culturally significant that no Assyrian king ever fully solved the problem of how to govern it without provoking resentment or rebellion. And it was into this vast and increasingly wealthy empire that a new dynasty was born, the Sargonid kings, beginning with Sargon II and continuing through his son Sennacherib, a ruler whose reign would become one of the most dramatically documented in the ancient world, thanks to the survival of records from both sides of his most famous campaign, the invasion of the Kingdom of Judah in 701 BC, an episode remembered not only in Assyrian royal inscriptions boasting of the destruction of the fortified city of Lachish, whose siege is depicted in extraordinary and gruesome detail on stone relief carvings that once decorated Sennacherib's palace walls, but also in the pages of the Hebrew Bible, which describes King Hezekiah of Judah paying a heavy tribute in silver and gold before the siege of Jerusalem was mysteriously lifted, an event that later biblical writers attributed to divine intervention, but that modern historians more plausibly attribute to an outbreak of disease within the Assyrian camp, a common hazard for any large ancient army operating far from home. And Sennacherib's later years took a darker turn when his own frustration with the perpetually rebellious city of Babylon boiled over into an act of destruction so total that it shocked even his own people, as he ordered the city razed, its temples demolished, and its floodwaters diverted to wash away the very foundations of its buildings, an act of vengeance that may have contributed to his own downfall, since he was eventually assassinated by his own sons while praying in a temple in Nineveh, plunging the empire into a succession crisis that was ultimately resolved by his younger son Esarhaddon, a king whose reign was marked by an unusual mixture of military ambition, including a successful invasion of Egypt and personal torment. As surviving letters between the king and his court physicians describe a man plagued by chronic illness, skin ailments, and what many modern scholars believe may have been a form of depression, made worse by a genuine and abiding fear of prophecy and omens that led him to repeatedly undergo a bizarre ritual known as the substitute king ceremony, in which a commoner would be dressed in royal robes and placed on the throne for 100 days to absorb any evil fate destined for the true king, before being ritually put to death so that the king himself could resume his rule unscathed. And it was Esarhaddon who devised what he hoped would be a lasting solution to the perennial problem of Babylon, dividing his inheritance between two sons, with Ashurbanipal set to rule the Assyrian Empire from Nineveh, while his older brother Shamash-Shum would rule Babylon as a subordinate king, a plan that held for over a decade before collapsing into one of the bloodiest civil wars in Assyrian history, as the Babylonian brother, resentful of his secondary status, allied with the neighboring kingdom of Elam and rose in open rebellion, forcing Ashurbanipal to lay siege to his own brother's city for 4 grueling years, a siege so severe that later accounts describe residents resorting to cannibalism before the city finally fell and burned, with Shamash-Shum reportedly perishing in the flames of his own palace, and having crushed his brother, Ashurbanipal turned the full fury of his army against Elam itself, not merely defeating it but attempting to erase it entirely as a political entity, sacking its capital city of Susa, destroying its temples, desecrating the tombs of its kings, and by his own account salting its fields so that nothing would grow there again, a campaign of annihilation that, while militarily successful, removed a regional power that had for centuries served as a check on the ambitions of another people watching from the eastern mountains, the Medes. And it is often noted with a certain grim irony that Ashurbanipal, for all his military ruthlessness, was also perhaps the most intellectually accomplished of all Assyrian kings, reportedly the first able to read and write himself rather than relying entirely on scribes. And he used this literacy to assemble what may have been the ancient world's first systematic library, gathering tens of thousands of clay tablets from across his empire covering subjects as varied as astronomy, medicine, mythology, law, and literature, including the most complete surviving version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a collection that, ironically, survived into the modern era precisely because the fire that would later destroy his palace baked the clay tablets hard, preserving them beneath the rubble for over 2,500 years, until archaeologists rediscovered them in the 19th century. And it is this same Ashurbanipal whose lion hunt reliefs, carved in the final decades of his reign, are today considered among the greatest surviving achievements of ancient Near Eastern art, depicting the ritual hunting of captive lions in scenes of remarkable anatomical precision, the animals rendered with a haunting, almost tragic expressiveness that stands in stark contrast to the more formal and emotionless depictions of the human figures around them. And these would prove to be among the last great artistic achievements of a civilization already approaching its end. Because, in the decades following Ashurbanipal's death around 631 BC, a death so poorly documented that historians still are not entirely certain of its circumstances, the empire he left behind unraveled with startling speed, weakened by years of internal strife, overextension, and quite possibly a prolonged climatic shift toward drier conditions that recent scientific studies of cave formations in northern Iraq suggest may have placed additional strain on an agricultural system already stretched thin by the demands of empire. And into this vacuum of weakened central authority stepped two rising powers who had every reason to hate Assyria and every incentive to see it destroyed: the Medes, an Iranian people who had been steadily consolidating power in the aftermath of Elam's destruction, and the Babylonians, now led by a king named Nabopolassar, a ruler of obscure origins who openly described himself in his own inscriptions as the son of a nobody, a telling sign of just how much the old social order was being upended in this chaotic period. And in 616 BC, these two powers began a coordinated assault on the Assyrian heartland, first capturing and sacking the ancient religious capital of Ashur itself in a devastating blow to Assyrian prestige, before turning their combined armies toward the empire's greatest and most glorious city, Nineveh, which fell after a brutal siege in the summer of 612 BC. An event so total in its destruction that archaeologists excavating the city's gates in the modern era have found the skeletal remains of defenders still lying where they fell in the final desperate fighting, weapons scattered around them exactly as they were left over 26 centuries ago. And the fall of Nineveh was greeted with undisguised joy by many of the peoples Assyria had conquered and oppressed over the centuries, nowhere more vividly than in the biblical book of Nahum, which describes the city's destruction in triumphant and vengeful terms as a long-overdue judgment against what it calls a bloody and deceitful city. And even after Nineveh's fall, a remnant of the Assyrian army continued to resist for a few more years under a general named Ashur-Uballit, retreating to the western city of Haran. But this final holdout was crushed by 610 BC. And with that defeat, the last vestiges of Assyrian political power vanished from history, its great cities left to crumble into the desert sands, so thoroughly abandoned that within a few centuries even their names had been forgotten by the people who lived among their ruins, remembered only in vague legends about ancient giants or the wrath of forgotten gods, until the Greek soldier and writer Xenophon stumbled across their remains, while leading a retreating army of Greek mercenaries through the region in 401 BC. Marveling at the scale of walls and structures far larger than anything he had seen in his homeland, without ever learning the true identity of the people who had built them. And it would not be until the careful archaeological and linguistic work of scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries that the voices of the Assyrians, preserved by chance in the fire-hardened clay of their own royal archives, would finally be deciphered and allowed to speak again, revealing not only the violence and conquest for which the empire became infamous, but also an extraordinarily rich record of everyday life, of merchants haggling over the price of wine, of children writing home to complain about their clothes, of physicians struggling to treat a king they could not save, and of poets mourning the loss of cities that had once seemed as permanent and eternal as the rivers that gave them life.